Welcome to Media and Monuments, presented by Women in Film and Video in Washington, D.C. Media and Monuments is conversations featuring industry pros speaking on a wide range of topics of interest to media makers.
Welcome to Media and Monuments. I'm your host, Jabbari, and today we have Jim Penola. He's a storyteller and a freelance storyboard artist and illustrator with experiences in short films, features, commercials, music videos, and documentaries. He's also the writer, producer, and host of the podcast, An Invitation to the Invitation, which breaks down the 2015 film, The Invitation. The podcast has earned acclaim from filmmakers and actors like Karan Kusama, John Carroll Lynch, and Logan Marshall Green, among others. Jim is currently a graduate student at the Savannah College of Art and Design pursuing an MFA in dramatic writing. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Tara. I'm very happy to be here. This is great.
So, to give a little bit of background for the listeners, I met you virtually because, full disclosure, I like Logan Marshall Green.
Don't we all?
So I was like, oh, I'm sure he's been on some podcasts. And then yours came and popped up. What made you decide to delve into that particular film? Let's start there.
That's a great question. The answer is it was something I think I first had the seed of the idea in, probably like summer 2019. And I have to give a shout out and at least some credit to someone who I consider to be like my podfather, if you will, my podcasting godfather, a writer, a journalist named Blake Howard, who's based out of Australia, I believe. And I mention him because in the summer of 2019, through the co-writer of The Invitation, actually, Phil Hay, who's married to Karan, who also produced the movie, he wrote it with Matt Manfredi, his writing partner. Through Phil Hay, I found out about Blake Howard's podcast, which is called One Heat Minute. And the whole premise of that is he, per episode, breaks down 1 minute from Michael Mann's Heat, one episode at a time.
Oh, so it's a long movie.
That is a very long movie. So you could see what an insane undertaking that is, right? So I remember hearing about that through Phil Hay, and just being like, wow, this is so cool. And I think I was scrolling through episodes. He was already pretty deep into it at that point. And I noticed he had secured an interview with Michael Mann himself. And I was like, wow. I was like, oh man, what if I did that one day? I'm not going to do that. And then fast forward to around like fall 2019, I was very heartbroken and upset, and things like drawing, like storyboards, like illustrating, were just like it felt very hollow, and I needed a different creative outlet. And I thought of that podcast thing again. I was like, and that like lit a spark in me. Like that made me excited about doing something creative. I had no sort of like previous emotional attachments to that medium because I'd never tried it before. So it was like, it felt new, it felt fresh, felt genuinely inspiring. And then of course that led into March 2020. So all the conditions weirdly, bizarrely fell into place a little bit. But I remained very proud of it. And by the time I did make it a public endeavor and started publishing episodes and whatnot, it got a really good response from the people involved. And because we started this conversation talking about Logan Marshall Green, let me give him a shout out, because I'm obviously a huge fan of him, not only as an actor, but as a filmmaker. And he said a few things. He has been so supportive, and it makes me a little emotional. He when I first announced the podcast, he replied to maybe some tweet of mine where he's like, Jim, this is great. Can't wait to hear your story. And then when I interviewed him, I got to tell him how much that meant to me. And on top of that, I think maybe a week or so after that, I'm not sure what the exact timeline is. I remember, opening up my phone and seeing LMG's now following you, and he had DM'd me saying, I don't even remember what he said, but it was blowing my mind.
And how did he find out about the podcast?
I had tagged basically everyone I could find that was involved in the movie in my very first announcement tweet.
It's super interesting. And because I work with a lot of companies and nonprofits and stuff with their social media, we're like, we got to tag them. We got to tag our funders. Right. We got to tag possible people we want to partner with. We got to whatever, because you never know. And you're an exact good example of that. I think you had released it during lockdown.
Yeah.
So people were sort of couldn't go anywhere and stuff. So they were kind of like, oh, what's this kind of thing? And it was just like the timing could not have gone better because you got the director, you got some of the actors, other people involved in the film. I was like, oh my God, it's like the dream come true.
It was. It totally was, because an invitation to the invitation is, I think, in essence, I was making it for two audiences. One was myself, and then the other was the filmmakers, the cast and the crew, sort of as a love letter. Like, hey, I love your movie. I've thought about it a lot. It is a selfish project in that it was my excuse to finally dissect and explore.
Before podcasting, before going into graduate school for writing and all that stuff, you started as a storyboard artist, illustrator. Could you break it down to what does that mean?
It is the role of an illustrator or artist in pre-production, most often in pre-production, who essentially just draws out the shots or frames that are going to be filmed once production starts. So it's not something every director does. Some people are very pro storyboards, some are very anti. There's some hilarious Werner Herzog quote where he says something like, storyboards are like the tool of the coward or something. Oh, yeah. Which is, I love Werner Herzog. I think it's hilarious. But the point being that it's very sort of a per director basis, and also sometimes, for say a corporate gig, the client just wants to see what the director is intending to shoot. So it's in essence a visual roadmap for any filmed media, music videos, commercials, feature films, short films, any visual media, storyboards can be applied to that. So it's really like sort of a comic book. It's doing the same things that comic books are doing, but with a more utilitarian purpose, if you will.
So do you work very closely with the director to get that vision?
I'm trying to think if there have been any instances where I haven't worked closely with the director, and I don't think there are any. So it actually is, now that I think about it more closely, it is sort of a strangely intimate dialogue with the director, because you are, as a storyboard artist, you're sort of acting as the executor of their vision, literally, in a way. I mention that just because you can't really get that from a production manager or a cinematographer necessarily. So it really has to be a one-to-one sort of dialogue for it to work effectively, because communication between those two parties is everything. So it is very much a director storyboard artist relationship for the storyboards to be created.
There is a quote by Alfred Hitchcock who is saying he loved the storyboard process, that he's like, I basically am making the film a second time and it's boring because he already worked with the storyboard artist. Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you heard about this?
I've definitely read some version of that. His storyboards are so beautiful. I forget who the artist usually is.
Yeah. And then I also remember the film Seven, David Fincher's Seven. There's an alternate ending in the DVD extras.
Right.
They didn't shoot it, but they had the storyboard. So you
Right.
could watch it. And I remember watching it and I'm like, dang, that's
Mm-hmm.
dark.
Mm-hmm.
Or no,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. The original ending was not as dark as what they chose.
That was it.
Not going to spoil it for people. Not going to
Sure.
spoil it. But
Mm-hmm.
did you ever watch those extras? Do you know what I'm talking
I
about?
definitely watched the seven ones. I remember that. I don't remember the content of the ending itself, but I do remember seeing the boards as a
Yes,
sort of showing the deleted scene through the illustrations, through the frames.
exactly. So
Yep.
so there are people who use it. And I also found your Vimeo.
Yeah.
And so it seems, think like Campo Viejo.
Oh, yeah.
Is that a commercial?
That was for a company called Edge DNA, New York-based company. Their specialization is sort of VR and AR, as in augmented reality type things. So anytime they would contact me, to my knowledge, it would usually be for me to create images that they would then use as a pitch for a client like Campo Viejo or for Life Water, people
Got
like
it.
that.
Okay.
So that was usually my role when they would ask for something from me, I think, to sort of execute a pitch that they were working on.
Got it. So it sounds like sometimes you have to be the eyes. Okay, so it's a scene between two people in a cafe.
Hmm.
One I'll do from, and it's a man and a woman. One is from the man's side, one is from the woman's side, over the shoulder. This is what I'm thinking. That's your interpretation, like that's what you're visualizing? Or are you talking to the director and he's like, I want it from, or they are asking for, I want it from the woman's side and then from his side, but I also want the woman's side to be in front of a window, something like that. Like who does that?
I think maybe in early days, getting out of undergrad, I can remember more instances of, say, being on a phone call with a director and getting verbal directions, and me like having to sort of like scramble to write notes either by hand or typing them somewhere on my computer. There have been times where I've sort of done very loose, rough thumbnails while speaking to a director. Um, and those were not super efficient ways of working. Again, those were like earlier days, so definitely still learning. In the more recent years, I've found that, I think both for myself and the director, that the most efficient way of getting the boards themselves is to have, in essence, a shot list from the director. And that'll usually come in the form of an email, which is very helpful. It sounds simple and basic, and it is, but it's so important because it shows both parties that there's a record of the shots that are wanted. So when I come back with, say, a first pass, it's like, well, if you look at the email chain, you said wide of the taco stand, and you said two characters coming in from the foreground. Having that record, having that chronological document is so important in my experience, not just as like my own personal reference guide. I can always go back to that's what they said. Okay. And like, there, like many times I will write out exactly what's in the shot list or something very similar, use their own words just to create that shared reality. You know what I mean? Because of course you're going to get notes, you're going to get changes, you're going to get feedback, but having that shared reality is, again, it's basic, but in my experience, it's so important. But to answer your question, having a shot list is really the best thing for a storyboard artist, I think, because it just becomes sort of a Bible. And, I think maybe when I was younger, I probably had a perception or a goal that being a board artist would be a place where I could really inject some creativity. And of course you do. That goes without saying. But I only mention that because, again, the more experience I accumulated, the more I realized the more clarity on the end of the director, the better. If you know exactly what you want as a director, that's going to make both of our lives easier. Because usually the turnarounds are very tight. So there isn't time to be like, oh, let's try this, let's try that. So the clearer you are as a filmmaker, the faster the results, the better the results. Just being as communicative as possible, really.
So, forgive my ignorance, but it would be like you're the first part. So, or is it more like the rehearsal stage where they can play around? They're like, oh, you know what? We want them to be to the side of the taco stand, not in front of this taco stand. We want not over the shoulder, but side to side shots. Like, where does that come in your experience?
I'll use a more recent project as an example, maybe, because, of course, a lot of the time, I think part of what is fun about even the role of being a board artist is really no two projects are alike. There's going to be different deadlines. There's going to be different X, Y, or Z. It's very, very rare that it'll be exactly the same, if ever. This music video I worked on maybe earlier this year or some months ago, there was dance choreography involved. And the director had sent me rehearsal footage of the choreography. So it wasn't the final actors doing it, but I assume it was the choreographers who were not only practicing the dance moves, but they were simultaneously practicing the camera moves that would go along with the dance moves. And that ended up being enormously helpful for me because I could just screenshot that rehearsal footage and use those exact poses. And like, honestly, I remember seeing that test footage and being like, well, you've these are the camera moves. This is the choreography. Are you sure you need me? Of course, I didn't say that. But it was the point being that there was precision and forethought that was happening, and it was being shared with me. So I was able to use that, and I think because of that, have ideal storyboards, because I was able to get a peek into the other departments that were also working on this same project, which is another way of saying that I don't think there's necessarily any real standard necessarily in terms of when they occur in pre-production, because even sometimes, like, this is probably an outlier, but like, Mission Impossible will be well into production and they will fly out a storyboard artist to observe the location, observe the set, and do the boards based on that. That, of course, is hyper budget. There's big stars involved, but there is flexibility, is what I'm saying. So that probably comes back to the fact that no two projects are necessarily alike. So I think it comes down to the director, essentially, how they want to sequence things. I think most directors have a good idea of how much time they would need to get the images they want before cameras officially start rolling. So there's a lot of wiggle room, I guess. Hopefully that brings some insight. I really think the only sort of golden rule, if any, with boards is to have them before you hit record. That's the whole point, having that map to not only make that sort of inner director vision tangible, but to share it with the crew, to share it with the cast. There's a great quote from Frances McDormand, I think, on the Criterion edition of Blood Simple, and she says something to the effect of like, anytime I meet a new director, the first thing I ask is, do you storyboard? And for her, that's so important because it's like, oh, so you do have a vision. You do have some idea of what you're doing, as opposed to just improving,
Got it.
off the top of your head. So I always find that fascinating. I love that there are sort of acolytes on both sides. I love the Matrix films, and the first three were just storyboarded within an inch of their life. It was so meticulous. It was, again, like a comic book. If you look up those storyboards, they are a comic book. They were drawn by comic book artists, Steve Skroce, Jeff Darrow. And I was watching the special features on the newest Matrix film, Resurrections. And Lana Wachowski, the director, is talking about how she basically no longer storyboards. And I mean, this is getting into so many other conversations, but I just find that so fascinating that there's room for both. And I think in her case, it's just interesting because she had basically gotten to a place of confidence as an artist and filmmaker where she just didn't need the boards anymore. And it also mirrors things that happened in her personal life, but essentially she had just become so experienced, so confident that it's just like, no, I know what I'm doing. And I think that's awesome. I think that's so cool. Yeah. So there's room for both in the world of filmmaking, and I just think that's cool. So I don't take it personally when filmmakers like Herzog are like, fuck storyboards. You know? I think they're great, but there's room for both approaches, and there should be.
Well, am I mistaken that you're also working on your first short film?
I've produced a couple short films in the past for fun. The one I'm producing right now, I think it's safe to say it's the first time where I've been the sole producer, the only producer on it. And I've never done one on this scale before. It's obviously micro budget, but being the only producer on it and doing it at this level is a new experience for me. And I'm definitely learning. And I actually had a meeting with the director today, an old friend of mine, and we were having a very similar discussion where just talking about, the things we missed and how this is going to help going forward. And we watched an assembly cut of what we had shot, and we were just taking notes on, dialogue replacement that we're going to need from most, if not all, of the actors. And that's been a really fun process because it's also a short film that I was the screenwriter for, which adds to how personal it is. But it as I said to some classmates of mine, it's one of the gratifying things about it has been how I've been reminded that I just really love the sort of smaller scale indie way of making a movie, by which I mean some of my peers produced films that were a little more crew heavy, a little more technical, things of that nature. And there are pros and cons to larger crew, smaller crew, obviously. But I guess in my current experience, I was just reminded how much I really enjoy the sort of fast and loose organic approach that really gets facilitated when you do have a smaller crew. Like I think our crew was maybe a 4 or 5 person crew, which is really
so tiny,
which is really small. And again, everyone's doing double duty because of that. But one of the strengths I found was that we could work in a very sort of discreet and fast way. It all takes place in one location, so that helps a lot. And the staff at the location were so generous, so that is also huge. But all of that being said, I still think there's really something special about the sort of space that you're given when you don't have to basically play a game of telephone with 8 different department heads. You can really just sort of, and at least in this scenario, it just created an environment where we could move quickly and efficiently. And those are not 2 adjectives you hear a lot when it comes to filmmaking necessarily. So anything that creates the conditions for you to work fast and efficient and have fun while doing it, that's great. And that was my experience in production in these last few weeks. And that's, the invitations was made under similar circumstances. So I was definitely thinking about that. Like, it's not a lot of money, not a lot of people, but there are benefits to it, and I was tangibly reminded in a firsthand way that there is something to that, and I think that is more my style when it comes to making stuff, to making movies, is that more intimate approach. I think that resonates more strongly with me, at least on a creative level.
Did you do storyboarding for these shorts that
Did
you've
not.
produced?
The short that I'm in post production for right now. It's called Closed Casket. It's a very silly comedy. I wrote it as well, and there's a brief discussion between myself and the director about doing boards, and the director, John, my friend, I've done boards for him in the past. He's in post for another film, actually. He's in post for Closed Casket and another film simultaneously. And he asked me to do a few boards for that as well. So we have done that many times. And we didn't end up doing it for this. I think probably just because of it being a one location story, engendered a sort of space where in other words, it wasn't a super meticulous or action heavy plot, so it could be a little more organic, which it was.
Mm-hmm.
So still had a shot list, but the other thing about storyboards is they are, generally speaking, used more for action heavy or complex sort of sequences, which is why you'll most often see them for like a car chase, or or a foot chase, or anything that involves sort of fast cutting and high speed, things of that nature. But again, they serve multiple purposes. Sometimes a client just wants to see what a director is thinking, and it doesn't have to be something super crazy or bombastic. But yeah, I think the only time I had really considered doing boards for this short, for Closed Casket, was in a promotional aspect, because it was, relatively speaking, a simple thing to shoot, and it didn't beg for pre-visualization. The only way I had really considered doing them was as a way to promote the movie, and that is still a possibility in a weird way. But I have boarded things I've shot in the past, and it's, as someone who is not a director, my limited experience in sort of communicating what's in the drawn storyboard frame to a camera operator or cinematographer, it's just a very confidence instilling tool, because I think the good directors are good communicators. And if you're having trouble communicating what a shot is, just being able to point at a picture, that eliminates that whole issue, essentially. Or it could.
Yeah.
But you see what I mean? It creates a shorthand that is very valuable,
Well, it goes back to that Alfred Hitchcock. I mean, he was like, oh, I've already done this.
Right.
It was basically that. He was like, I already filmed this.
I love that.
With the storyboard illustrator.
I have a lot of love for storyboards and sequential art, and part of the reason I've sort of begun to slowly pivot away is because I think there are just way better people out there to be doing it other than me. I have so much love for the art form. I was at my brother's yesterday or 2 days ago, and I was browsing his shelf, and I picked up the Tenet paperback that he had on his shelf. Tenet, as in the Christopher Nolan screenplay.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I immediately flipped to the back because I knew there were storyboards in it, and I don't think I'd ever really looked at them before, and I just got so sucked into them. I find it so unique. I find it to be such a unique medium because, say by comparison, comic books, like that is the final form. The comic book, the graphic novel, that is the final form. Storyboards are sort of like they occupy a weird liminal space where they have that very utilitarian context where it's like, all right, guys, this is what we're shooting today. Get the DP over here. Get the lead over here. This is what we're doing. This is the idea. And and then you shoot it and you edit it, and they've sort of served their purpose, and they sort of get locked away or whatever, thrown in a vault. But they're often so beautiful, and then you get to compare the board with the final shot, and I just find that so fascinating, how they are both artistic and utilitarian, essentially. I feel like that's sort of like a strangely rare mix. And I think it's a reason I will always just love them, and I especially love them for live action, because in animation it's really non-negotiable. You have to have storyboards, period, for your film. In live action, like we were discussing, you've got your Herzogs who are like, no. And you got maybe, say, your Nolans who are like, oh, we need boards. So the fact that it is sort of artist specific, it just creates this this sort of conversation about what is required of films, and how does the choice to use boards or not really affect your movie. I like that. I just think it's so cool. So many things are, of course, becoming automated, right? And now we've got AI art. That's a whole new wrinkle to the creative conversation. And despite all that, like, I never really see storyboards going away, and I think that's so. I think that's so cool. As much as we can sort of defer to machinery and to artificial intelligence, miraculously, it's like it's just specific enough that I can't imagine automated storyboards. There's, of course, 3D pre-visualization that's used as a sort of alternative to storyboards sometimes, but at the end of the day, a film is a 2D screen or a 2D projection, so there is that sort of crossover between the final image and what the artist is drawing on an iPad or a piece of paper. I don't think they will ever really truly be phased out. They're just too useful. They're too useful, and movies are too expensive.
Yeah,
for them not to exist. So you know what I mean? Like, we've got the Lana Wachowskis of the world who are brilliant enough to show up and improvise, but for the rest of us, storyboards are a godsend. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And congratulations on all the success with your podcast, with your short films and graduate's degree, and becoming a master is what I call it.
Thank
and
you.
All that stuff. So thank you.
I thank you. Appreciate it so much. I had so much fun.
Thank you for listening to Media and Monuments, a service of Women in Film and Video in Washington, D.C. Please remember to review, rate, and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast. For more information about WIF, please visit our website at WIF as in Frank, V as in Victor.org.